The air in Chongqing doesn't just fill your lungs, it has weight. In late 1941, it was a heavy blanket woven from 3 distinct threads, the perpetual dampness that rose from the Yangtze River, clinging to the skin like a second, colder layer, the acrid metallic tang of smoke from distant fires that never truly went out, and the fine, chalky dust of pulverized concrete, a constant reminder of the buildings that were there yesterday, and were not today. Before the bombs fell, the first warning was a sound, a low, mournful siren that didn't so much cry out as it slithered through the city's steep, terraced streets. It was the sound of the sky turning against the earth, a mechanical beast clearing its throat before it screamed, and for the people below, it was the signal to descend into the damp, suffocating darkness of the dugouts, leaving their world to the mercy of the men who fought above. This city, carved into the very bones of the mountainside, was a portrait of stubborn survival. It was a place that refused to die, its will as unyielding as the rock it was built upon. But how do you fight an enemy who lives in the clouds, an enemy who rains down destruction from a place you cannot reach? The people of Chongqing placed their faith in a different kind of men who willingly climbed into the sky to meet that threat. They were the pilots of the Chinese Air Force, a small, determined fraternity armed with foreign-made planes and a desperate love for the land below. They were the city's immune system, its feverish, violent response to an infection that came from above. Their battlefield was the vast, unforgiving expanse of the sky, a place of terrible beauty where victory and death were separated by a fraction of a second. Among these men, Captain Gao Wei was a figure of pure logic. At 28, he was the leader of the 24th Pursuit Group, a man who believed that war in the air was not a chaotic brawl, but a problem of physics to be solved. His American training had instilled in him a reverence for precision, for the cold, hard mathematics of altitude, speed, and coordinated firepower. In his mind, the sky was a 3-dimensional grid, and a dogfight was a series of geometric proofs written in smoke and steel. His cockpit was a sanctuary of order, every gauge polished, every lever in its exact place. He didn't hate the Japanese pilots. To him, they were merely variables in a complex equation. His driving force was a fierce, protective intelligence, a belief that a superior strategy, perfectly executed, could overcome any disadvantage in technology or numbers. He viewed his squadron of 12 Polikarpov I-16s not as a group of individual aces, but as a single, unified weapon, an extension of his own disciplined mind. He had trained them relentlessly, drilling them until their formations were flawless, their movements synchronized like the gears of a fine watch. When they took off, the roar of their engines was not a cacophony, but a single resonant chord of purpose. They were a testament to his philosophy, that the collective, guided by unwavering reason, was invincible. His men trusted him implicitly, their faith in his calculations as solid as the steel frames of their aircraft. They were a flying embodiment of order, a precise and deadly machine designed to impose logic upon the madness of war. Their weakness, though none of them could yet see it, was that they knew how to fight a machine but not a ghost. The day it began was like any other. The siren's call, the frantic scramble across the muddy airfield, the familiar scent of high-octane fuel mixing with the morning fog. Gao Wei felt the usual cold calm settle over him as he strapped himself into his cockpit, his movements economical and sure. The mission was routine: intercept a wave of Japanese G4M Betty bombers escorted by fighters. It was a problem he had solved before. As his squadron climbed through the thick grey clouds, they broke into the clear, brilliant sunlight above, a world of serene blue that stood in stark contrast to the besieged city below. They formed up, a perfect V formation cutting through the sky, confident in their plan, their training, and their leader. If you understand the chilling resolve it takes to fly towards danger, let us know where you're watching from. They engaged the Japanese escort fighters exactly as planned, a flurry of controlled, disciplined attacks. The sky became a lethal chessboard, and Gao Wei was its master, directing his pieces with cool precision. Then something broke the pattern. A single enemy fighter, a sleek, unusually agile Ki43 Hayabusa, detached from the main Japanese formation. It didn't dive to attack or climb to engage. Instead, it banked gracefully, almost languidly, and began to move in a way that defied every principle of aerial combat Gao Wei had ever studied. It wasn't flying a tactical pattern. It was performing a dance. It was an anomaly, a whisper of chaos in his perfectly ordered world, and in that moment the entire nature of his war was about to change. The equation he had so carefully constructed was suddenly faced with a variable he could not comprehend. The lone Japanese fighter moved like a drop of ink bleeding into water. It didn't peel off with the aggressive, angular momentum of an attacker. It simply drifted. Gao Wei watched from his cockpit, his mind a flurry of calculations, but none of them could account for this. The Ki-43 Hayabusa descended in a slow, deliberate spiral, its silver fuselage catching the morning sun like a sliver of polished bone. Below, the brutal symphony of the dogfight raged on, a predictable cacophony of machine gun fire and roaring engines. But this single plane was a silent note, a whisper of dissent in the violent chorus. It ignored the bombers. It ignored the escort. It ignored every established rule of engagement. It was an object of impossible grace in a theater of pure function, and its serene detachment was more menacing than any direct assault. Gao Wei's hands, usually so steady on the controls, felt a foreign tremor. His mind, a fortress of tactical doctrine, was breached. He cycled through every possibility taught to him in American flight schools. Was it a lure designed to draw them into a larger trap? Was the pilot wounded, his plane crippled? But the aircraft's movements were too precise, too fluid for a machine in distress. It flew with an unnerving confidence, as if the sky belonged to it alone. It wasn't following a combat manual. It was composing a poem. Gao Wei felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not a variable in his equation. It was a new form of mathematics entirely, one whose language he did not understand, and its presence made his own disciplined logic feel clumsy and archaic. Then the dance began in earnest. The Ki-43 dipped its nose and plunged toward the earth, not in a dive-bombing run, but in a sweeping bow to the landscape itself. It followed the winding contours of the Yangtze River Valley, its wingtips nearly skimming the thick white mist that clung to the water's surface. It used the city's terraced hillsides as a slalom course, appearing and disappearing behind ridges with the playful elusiveness of a phantom. The clouds were not obstacles to this pilot. They were curtains on a stage, pulled back for a dramatic reveal and then drawn close to conceal his next move. He was not merely flying through the environment. He was collaborating with it, turning the very air and fog of Chongqing into his accomplices, his silent partners in this bewildering performance. The effect on Gao Wei's squadron was catastrophic. Their greatest strength, their perfect synchronized formation, became their fatal flaw. The Ghost, as he would later be known, weaved through their attack patterns with surgical precision, forcing them to break away not from him, but from each other. Two of the I-16s nearly collided, their pilots yanking their sticks in opposite directions with a shared gasp of terror. The squadron's disciplined V formation devolved into a chaotic swarm of individual pursuits. They were no longer a single cohesive weapon. They were 12 separate, frustrated men, chasing a shadow that was always one step ahead, a ghost that turned their collective might into a tangled, impotent mess. Gao Wei could only watch as his perfectly tuned machine was dismantled, gear by gear, by an artist wielding a paintbrush of steel and smoke. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it felt like an eternity of humiliation. The Ki-43 pilot never lined up a killing shot. His machine guns remained silent. His goal was not destruction, but deconstruction, a complete psychological dismantling of his opponents. He had proven with terrifying elegance that he could render them entirely irrelevant. Having thoroughly neutralized the entire squadron, the lone fighter climbed steeply, leveled off and performed a slow, deliberate waggle of its wings. It was not a gesture of aggression or triumph, but something far more unsettling, a salute, a mocking acknowledgement of their shared space in the sky. Then, banking gracefully, it climbed directly into the blinding glare of the morning sun and simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but the echo of its impossible flight. The flight back to the airfield was conducted in a profound and heavy silence. No one spoke over the radio. There was nothing to say. Their fuel tanks were still mostly full, their ammunition belts untouched. They had failed to protect the city. failed to engage the enemy, failed in every metric of their mission. Yet they had not been outfought or outgunned. They had been outthought, outmaneuvered, outclassed in a way that defied every principle of modern warfare. For Zhao Wei, the silence in his cockpit was the sound of his entire world breaking. The clean geometric lines of his strategic mind were now covered in the chaotic, unknowable calligraphy of the ghost. He had met an enemy who did not follow the rules of war, and in doing so had rewritten them completely. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet, personal hell. Gao Wei grounded himself, a captain willingly clipping his own wings. The debriefing room became his cell, its air thick with the ghosts of unspoken questions and the bitter taste of failure. He spent hours hunched over a small wooden table, his notebooks filling with frantic, angular sketches of the engagement. He drew the V formation of his squadron, a perfect, rigid spear of logic. Then he would try to draw the ghost's path, but his pen could not replicate the fluid, impossible curves. His lines were angry, broken things, the furious scratching of a mathematician trying to solve an equation with no numbers. His men watched him from a distance, their respect curdling into a mixture of pity and fear. They saw a leader consumed not by a desire for revenge, but by an obsession with understanding his own humiliation. His investigation began as an exercise in pure reason, the only method he trusted. He requisitioned every piece of available data, after-action reports from every pilot, reconnaissance photographs of the attack, maintenance logs, and even meteorological charts for that specific morning. He pinned maps of the river valley to the wall, marking each squadron member's position with colored pins, creating a static, three-dimensional model of their defeat. He searched for a mechanical flaw, a tactical error, a logical explanation that would restore order to his world. But the data only deepened the mystery. The Ki43 had performed maneuvers that should have torn its wings off. It had achieved rates of climb that defied the known specifications of its engine. The reports were a chorus of cold, hard facts that screamed one impossible truth. The ghost should not exist. The breakthrough came not from the numbers, but from the spaces between them. Late one night, staring at a photograph of the ghost banking over the Yangtze, Gao Wei noticed something. The plane's movement was not independent of the landscape. It was in perfect harmony with it. He overlaid the meteorological charts onto the tactical map and saw it clearly. The ghost's impossible climb had used a thermal updraft rising from the river. His sudden disappearance had been a masterful use of a dense pocket of fog, a feature of the valley at that exact hour. The pilot wasn't just flying in the sky. He was reading it, speaking its language. He was not a soldier executing a maneuver. He was a calligrapher laying a single perfect brushstroke upon the vast canvas of the valley, using the wind and mist as his ink. This realization shattered Gao Wei's methodology. His charts and numbers were useless. To understand this new form of warfare, he had to abandon the classroom and re-enter the temple. He began a series of solo flights, taking his I-16 up at dawn, not to patrol for enemies but to listen. He flew without a flight plan, following the contours of the land, feeling the subtle shifts in air pressure as he passed from over the river to over the hills. He learned how the morning sun created blinding corridors of light between the peaks, and how the ever-present fog had a weight and texture that could be used as a shield. He was no longer a commander imposing his will upon the sky. He was a student, humbly asking for its secrets, learning to feel the air not as an obstacle but as an ally, a living, breathing entity. His notebooks began to change. The pages of rigid geometric diagrams and angry calculations were slowly replaced by something new. He abandoned his ruler and compass, and his hand, now guided by memory and feeling, began to sketch fluid, organic lines. He drew the ghost's flight path not as a series of vectors, but as a single unbroken arc, like the sweep of a bird's wing or the flow of water around a stone. It was a language of instinct, not of intellect. He was unlearning years of training, shedding the armor of American precision to rediscover a more ancient, intuitive wisdom. In tracing the movements of his enemy, he was inadvertently mapping the transformation of his own soul, from a soldier of logic to a poet of the air. He tried to impart this new philosophy to his men, but his words were a foreign language to them. During training drills, he ordered them to break their perfect formations, to dance with the clouds and feel the river's breath. He instructed them to fly not in straight lines, but in sweeping, unpredictable curves. They stared at him with bewildered eyes. They were soldiers, trained to be a single, unified machine. He was asking them to become a flock of birds, to abandon the certainty of the collective for the chaos of individual intuition. Their faith in him, once as solid as the mountains, began to erode. They saw his new methods not as a radical strategy, but as the ramblings of a man broken by a ghost, a commander lost in the very fog of war he claimed to understand. Gao Wei felt their doubt, their fear, and it isolated him completely. Yet he persisted, driven by a certainty that transcended their skepticism. In his solitary cockpit, high above the wounded city, he came to a profound and unsettling conclusion. His obsession was no longer fueled by shame or a desire for victory. It had become a form of reverence. The ghost was no longer just an enemy. He was an enigma, a master artist who had revealed to Gao Wei the limitations of his own craft. The fight was no longer about shooting down a single Japanese plane. It was about proving himself worthy of the lesson he was being taught. He was no longer hunting a phantom. He was preparing with a strange and solemn patience to finally meet his teacher. The resistance began not in the sky, but in a small, smoke-filled room on the ground. Gao Wei stood before General Chen, a man whose face was a roadmap of past wars, etched with the hard lines of pragmatism. Chen's heavy fist slammed down on a map of Chongqing, making the colored pins quiver. He had no time for what he called aerial philosophy. He wanted results, wreckage, a confirmed kill. He held up one of Gao Wei's notebooks, its pages filled with the fluid, calligraphic sketches of the ghost's flight. "What is this, Captain?" "A book of poetry. Your men are losing faith, the city is losing hope. And you are drawing birds." Gao Wei tried to explain that this was a new language of war, a strategy of intuition, but his words dissolved in the thick air of the general's disbelief. He was dismissed with a cold, clear ultimatum: shoot the ghost down, or be replaced by someone who would. The general's skepticism was a formal decree, but the doubt of his own men was a slow-acting poison. In the mess hall, conversations would stop when he entered. The easy camaraderie they once shared had evaporated, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. He was no longer their leader. He was an object of pity and concern. He saw them huddled in corners, whispering, their glances a mixture of confusion and betrayal. They were soldiers, trained for the brutal mathematics of combat, and he was asking them to solve a spiritual riddle. They had trusted his logic implicitly, followed his precise commands into the heart of battle. Now his commands were whispers of wind and fog, and they could not follow him into that intangible realm. Their faith in him had been the engine of their collective strength, and now that engine was sputtering, threatening to die completely. Alone in his quarters under the weak glow of a single bulb, Gao Wei fought a war on a second front, the one inside his own mind. The faces of his men, etched with doubt, haunted him. The general's ultimatum echoed in the silence. Was he a fool? Was he chasing a phantom born of his own humiliation, leading his squadron toward a cliff of his own making? He spread his old American flight manuals across his desk, their pages filled with the comforting certainty of angles, velocities, and kill probabilities. For a moment, he longed for that simplicity, for the clear, cold logic that had once defined his world. Then his eyes fell upon his own drawings of the ghost's flight. They were chaotic, yet they held a deeper order. He was caught in a terrifying limbo between the man he was and the man he was becoming, and he feared he might be lost to both. Clarity came, as it always did, in the solitude of the sky. He took his I-16 up in the pre-dawn chill, not on patrol but on a pilgrimage. He flew to the exact spot over the Yangtze, where the ghost had performed his impossible climb. He had a theory, a whisper of an idea born from his meteorological charts. He found the thermal updraft, a column of warmer air rising from the river's surface, invisible to the eye but not to the skin of his plane. He nosed his aircraft into it, pushing the machine to its limits. The I-16 shuddered violently, protesting this violation of its known physics. For a heart-stopping second, he felt the controls go slack, the plane threatening to stall. But then it happened. The aircraft caught the current, and he was lifted, thrown upward with a silent, exhilarating grace. It was not a maneuver. It was a secret whispered to him by the wind itself. He was not mad. He landed with the fire of revelation in his eyes, desperate to share this new gospel with his men. He gathered them on the tarmac, his voice urgent, trying to explain the physics of the unseen, the alliance with the air itself. He took them up for a training drill, instructing them to feel the currents, to let the landscape guide their wings. But their hands were too heavy on the controls, their minds shackled by years of rigid training. They flew like men fighting the sky, not partnering with it. After they landed, his second-in-command, Lieutenant Feng, a pilot whose loyalty he had never questioned, faced him. "Captain, with respect," Feng's voice was strained. "You are teaching us to pray when we need to learn how to aim. We are not artists. We are soldiers. Show us how to kill the enemy, not how to dance with him." The words struck Gao Wei with the force of a physical blow, cementing his profound isolation. Feng's words, meant to be an anchor to reality, instead set Gao Wei free. He returned to his room and looked at the wall of sketches, no longer with the desperation of a codebreaker, but with the quiet awe of a student. He finally understood. His obsession was no longer about revenge or redemption. The shame had burned away, the anger had cooled, and what remained was a pure, undiluted reverence. The ghost was not an enemy to be vanquished. He was a master who had revealed the true depth of their shared craft. The battle was no longer for the skies over Chongqing. It was for his own soul. To prove himself worthy of the lesson, he had to stop trying to defeat his teacher and instead prepare to meet him, to show him that his sublime, terrifying instruction had been understood. A deep, unshakable calm settled over him. He accepted his solitude as a necessary part of the journey. He could not make his men see the world through his eyes, so he would have to fly for them, to be their shield while he pursued this higher purpose. He began his preparations, but they were different now. He worked on his own I-16, his hands moving with the care of a monk tending to a sacred shrine. He cleaned every instrument, polished every inch of the canopy, checked every wire not as a mechanic but as a musician tuning his instrument for a final, perfect performance. He was no longer a commander preparing his squadron for war. He was a duelist, sharpening his sword for an encounter that would be judged not by victory or defeat, but by the elegance and truth of his own movements. He was ready to answer the question the ghost had first asked him, written in smoke and air months ago. The revelation did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, quiet bleed of ink on paper. One night, under the solitary glow of a desk lamp, Gao Wei stared at the wall of maps until his eyes burned. He had been trying to find the flaw in the ghost's machine, but the truth was in the canvas itself. His finger traced the deep, winding scar of the Yangtze River on the tactical map. Then he overlaid a meteorological chart from that fateful morning. It was there, a pocket of unusually dense fog, a known phenomenon at that specific bend in the river, a documented thermal updraft, a column of warm air rising invisibly toward the heavens. The ghost hadn't defied physics. He had harnessed them. He wasn't breaking the rules of the sky. He was using its secret grammar. The impossible climb, the sudden vanishing act, they were not magic. They were a collaboration, a perfect, deadly dialogue between pilot and atmosphere. The theory was a fragile thing, a whisper of intuition in a mind built of concrete logic. It had to be tested. Before the next dawn, Gao Wei was in the air, his I-16 a familiar weight around him. He flew not toward an enemy, but toward a location on a map, a specific point over the river where the air was said to rise. He approached it with the caution of a man stepping onto thin ice. He felt the subtle shudder in the wings, the slight lift. His training screamed at him to correct, to stabilize, to impose order. Instead, he did the opposite. He yielded. He relinquished control, letting the unseen current take hold of his plane. The I-16 groaned, its steel frame protesting this violation of its nature. But then it rose. It was a silent, terrifying, exhilarating ascent, a feeling not of flying but of being flown. In that moment, he knew his enemy was not a man in a machine, but a force in perfect harmony with the world. His solo flights became a ritual, a silent apprenticeship. He abandoned the rigid grid of patrol routes and began to follow the contours of the land, the flow of the wind. He learned that the morning fog over Chongqing was not a single entity, but a living tapestry of varying densities, a landscape of its own with valleys and peaks that could conceal or reveal. He discovered the corridors of blinding sunlight that the rising sun carved between the mountains, corridors the ghost had used to disappear. He began to feel the air not as an empty medium to be traversed, but as a textured living presence, an ally or an adversary, depending on whether you listened. He was unlearning the science of combat and remembering an older, more primal art, the art of observation, of becoming one with the environment until the distinction between the hunter and the forest disappears. The transformation was most evident in his notebooks. The pages once filled with precise angles, velocity calculations, and furious broken lines were gradually covered by something new. He put away his ruler and compass. His hand, now guided by a different kind of knowledge, began to move with a fluid grace. He sketched the ghost's flight path, not as a tactical diagram, but as a single, unbroken brushstroke of calligraphy. He drew the spiral descent like a falling leaf, the climb like a hawk catching a thermal. He was no longer trying to deconstruct a maneuver. He was trying to capture an essence, a spirit. He was mapping the poetry of his enemy's movements, and in doing so, he was charting the slow, painful, and beautiful dissolution of his own rigid certainty. The soldier was becoming a student, the engineer a poet. He tried to share this new gospel, but the words felt clumsy and strange in the shared air of the barracks. He gathered his pilots, his voice filled with the fire of his discovery, and told them they must learn to breathe with the valley and listen to the fog. He took them into the sky and ordered them to break their perfect, rigid formations, to fly not as a spear, but as a scattered flock of birds, each following the intuition of the currents. They tried, their hands heavy on the controls, their movements stiff and uncertain. They were a machine trying to imitate a living thing. After a particularly frustrating drill, Lieutenant Feng, his most trusted officer, approached him, his face a mask of concern. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we don't understand. We are not birds. We are soldiers. Teach us how to fight, not how to dance." The resistance from his men was a quiet erosion of trust, but the opposition from his superiors was a stone wall. General Chen summoned him to his command post, the air thick with cigar smoke and impatience. He slapped one of Gao Wei's notebooks onto the table, its pages of calligraphic sketches open for all to see. "What is this, Captain? Are you an artist now?" Chen's voice was a low growl of contempt. "I need kills. I need reports of enemy wreckage, not drawings of the wind. Your squadron's morale is at rock bottom, and the city looks to the sky for protectors, not philosophers. This ghost is one pilot in one plane. Your obsession is becoming a liability. Shoot him down, or I will find a man who can think in straight lines." The ultimatum was clear. Abandon this new path or be cast out from the world of logic and order for good. Dismissed by his general and misunderstood by his men, Gao Wei found a strange and profound peace in his isolation. The shame that had fueled his initial obsession had burned away, replaced by a quiet, solemn reverence. He finally understood the true nature of his quest. The ghost was no longer an enemy to be destroyed, but a master who had opened a door to a deeper understanding of his craft. To pull the trigger would be to silence the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The battle was no longer for the city, or for his reputation, or even for victory. It was a private pilgrimage. He would continue to protect his men and his city, but his ultimate purpose had changed. He was no longer preparing for a fight. He was preparing, with the meticulous care of a scholar, to meet his teacher and show him that the lesson had been learned. The siren's call was different this time. It was not a warning of death from above, but an invitation. As the dark formation of Japanese bombers stained the horizon, Gao Wei felt a profound calm settle over his soul. His squadron formed up, a familiar and comforting shield of steel and purpose. Then he saw it, a single glint of silver, detaching itself from the chaos with an artist's deliberate grace. It was the ghost. His heart did not pound with rage or fear, but with a strange, solemn recognition, as if meeting an old friend for a final, fateful encounter. The time for learning was over. He keyed his microphone, his voice steady and clear. "Squadron, hold defensive pattern. Protect the city. I will engage him alone." The radio remained silent. A void filled with the unspoken shock and reluctant obedience of his men as he banked his I-16, turning away from the larger battle and toward his own private war. High above the burning city, the sky became a sacred arena, A silent space emptied of everything but two pilots and their machines. There was no radio chatter, only the resonant hum of their engines and the whisper of wind over their canopies. The Ghost initiated the duel, a sweeping, lyrical maneuver that had once filled Galway with impotent fury. But this time Galway did not chase. He anticipated. He felt the subtle shift in the air, the invisible column of warmth rising from the river he now knew as intimately as his own breath. He met the Ghost's move not in reaction but in conversation. His Polikarpov, once a rigid instrument of cold logic, was now a fluid extension of his own intuition, a brushstroke answering another across the vast blue canvas. It was a terrifying, beautiful ballet, a silent dialogue of impossible grace, understood only by the two men who were writing it in smoke and steel. They climbed and spiraled, a deadly dance between two masters, testing the absolute limits of their craft. For minutes that stretched into an eternity, they were perfectly matched, two opposing forces locked in a state of sublime equilibrium. The Ghost used the familiar curtains of fog, but Galway now knew their texture and their secrets, moving through them not as an intruder but as a native. The Ghost used the sun's blinding glare, but Galway had studied its angles, anticipating where the corridors of light would open and where the shadows would offer sanctuary. Then it happened. A fractional error, a moment of hesitation. The Ghost, perhaps startled by this ghost of his own reflection, misjudged a current, his wing dipping for a microsecond too long. It was the opening. Galway dove, not with the fury of a soldier, but with the focused precision of a surgeon, his machine gun spitting a single, short burst that tore into the Ki-43's engine. The elegant Japanese fighter faltered, its song replaced by a rough, discordant cough. A thin ribbon of black smoke began to trail from its engine, a fatal wound in its otherwise perfect form. The dance was broken. Galway closed the distance, years of training taking over, the hunter's instinct driving him forward. He lined up the shot, the enemy cockpit filling his gun sight. This was the logical conclusion, the final variable in a long and painful equation. The kill. His finger tightened on the trigger. The general's ultimatum, his men's doubt, the city's suffering. It all demanded this one simple act of violence. But in that instant the sun shifted, cutting through the plexiglass at a perfect, impossible angle. For a single, eternal second, the glare vanished from the Ghost's canopy, and Galway saw his face. It was not the face of a monster. It was not a faceless symbol of the enemy, or a demon from the sky. It was simply the face of a man. Through the glass he saw a pilot, whose expression was not one of terror but of a profound, almost serene acceptance. There was no panic in his eyes, only a quiet focus and perhaps a flicker of astonished respect. In that shared moment of pure human vulnerability, the entire war, the noise, the hatred, the orders, dissolved into the silent space between them. Galway finally understood. His obsession was never about revenge. It was a pilgrimage to the heart of his craft. He had been searching for a master, and he had found him. To pull the trigger now would be to destroy the very thing he had come to revere. It would be a desecration. The Ghost, knowing his fate was sealed, lifted a gloved hand from his controls. It was not a gesture of surrender, but a slow, deliberate salute. It was the final silent word in their long and violent conversation, a quiet acknowledgement from one master to another. Galway's finger relaxed on the trigger. He pulled the nose of his I-16 up, his plane rising just above the crippled fighter, a gesture of his own. He watched as the Ghost guided his wounded aircraft away, a silver bird with a broken wing, limping toward the horizon until it disappeared into the vast, indifferent blue. He had disobeyed a direct order. He had failed his mission, but in the quiet of his cockpit, surrounded by the infinite sky, Galway knew with absolute certainty that he had just won the only war that had ever truly mattered. Galway landed his Polikarpov, I-16, in a silence that was profoundly different from the one that had followed his first encounter with the Ghost. That had been a heavy, suffocating silence thick with shame and confusion. This was something else entirely. It was a silence of awe, of questions too deep to be voiced over a crackling radio. As his propeller spun to a halt, the ground crew approached with a new kind of reverence, their movements slow and deliberate. His men gathered, their faces turned toward him, but no one spoke. They had seen the bombers scatter. They had won the day. But they knew that the true victory had occurred far above them, in a silent theater of the sky, where their commander had faced not just an enemy, but an idea and had returned fundamentally changed. He offered no report, no explanation. There were no words for what had transpired. He stood before General Chen, the official report a thin, lifeless document in his hand. It stated the facts. Enemy bombers repelled. 1 escort fighter engaged and severely damaged. Last seen heading east trailing smoke. There was no mention of the duel, the salute, the moment of recognition. To the general, it was an incomplete mission, a failure to secure a confirmed kill, the final unforgivable act of an obsession that had compromised a commander. Gao Wei was stripped of his command, grounded indefinitely. The verdict, which would have once shattered his world, landed with no impact. He accepted the punishment with a quiet serenity, the calm of a man who had already faced a far more profound judgment in the silent space between 2 cockpits, and had found himself, unexpectedly, acquitted. The world of ranks and orders had become small and distant. Though he no longer wore the title of commander, his authority had never been greater. His pilots, who had once seen him as a man descending into madness, now saw him as a keeper of a sacred secret. They would find him by the hangars, not to ask about tactics, but to ask what he had learned. Lieutenant Feng, his face stripped of its former skepticism, approached him one evening as the sun bled across the horizon. "Captain," he asked, his voice low, "what did you see up there?" Gao Wei did not speak of thermal updrafts or the density of fog. He spoke of harmony, of respect, of the terrible beauty of a worthy adversary. He began to teach them again, not how to fight, but how to see. He taught them that the sky was not a battlefield to be conquered, but a living entity to be understood, and that true mastery was not about imposing your will, but about finding your place within its vast, silent poetry. The war in China raged on, a relentless engine of attrition and sorrow, but the ghost of Chongqing was never seen again. He vanished from the sky as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only a legend that was whispered in hushed tones by pilots on both sides of the conflict. For Gao Wei, the memory of their final encounter became a defining landmark in the landscape of his own soul. In the years that followed, through countless other battles and the grinding horror of the long war, that silent duel remained his private sanctuary, a moment of pure, terrible clarity. He would look up at the sky, a canvas of endless conflict, and see not a space to be owned or defended, but a shared cathedral where he had once met the gaze of his enemy and, for one eternal second, had seen a brother. Decades later, the sounds of war have faded into the pages of history. The city of Chongqing, once a portrait of stubborn survival, is now a monument to it, its terraced hillsides gleaming with new life. An old man sits by a window, the light catching the silver in his hair. In his weathered hands, he turns over a small, exquisitely carved wooden model, not of the rugged I-16 he once flew, but of a sleek, elegant Ki-43 Hayabusa. He had learned the hardest and most beautiful lesson of his life in the sky that day. He learned that in the brutal anonymity of war, the most profound victory is not in killing your enemy, but in the revolutionary act of recognizing his humanity. He had been sent into the heavens to destroy a phantom, but in its place he had discovered the solid, undeniable truth of his own soul. He looks from the model in his hands to the sky outside his window, a peaceful expanse of blue that holds no hint of the violence it once contained. Yet for him that sky will forever be a sacred text, inscribed with the memory of a silent conversation, a duel that was not a fight to the death, but a dance toward mutual understanding. He finally understood that a true master of any craft is measured not by what he is willing to destroy, but by what he has the wisdom and the courage to preserve. For in the heart of conflict, where all seems lost to hatred, the ultimate triumph is not to defeat your enemy, but to find in him a piece of yourself. If you believe that a single moment of connection can be more powerful than a lifetime of conflict, let us know in the comments.